Very good. Thanks for the introduction, Hayley. I really appreciate that. And thanks everyone joining today. Hope you find this session valuable. I've been given the title, Reducing Methane Emissions and Increasing Profitability, and I'm actually going to just slightly expand on that, and I'm going to touch on the broader carbon cycle on grazing properties. So I will touch on vegetation and soil carbon to the latter part of the discussion as well, and I'll welcome some time at the end for comments and questions. What we want to cover is overview of greenhouse gas emissions from grazing enterprises, some industry benchmarks, key levers for emission reduction, being livestock management, storing carbon in vegetation, storing carbon in soil. And this is really, you need to view this as a pretty big topic if you're just approaching it. So it's a little bit of an overview today. You could spend at least a day, maybe even multiple days talking about these topics if you really wanted to unpack them. But see it as an overview, and hopefully it'll flag areas that you can follow up on later as your interest dictates. Just a quick introduction to us. I'm sure I haven't met you all. Integrity Ag and Environment, I'm the Managing Director based out of Queensland, Toowoomba, as Hayley mentioned. And our work's a specialist in agri-environmental consulting. That covers traditional areas, environmental regulation, and across a fairly broad sort of base there, from pigs, poultry, feedlots, and so on. And then we do a lot of work in this sort of sustainability reporting, life cycle assessment, carbon markets as well. For me personally, I have a property in northern New South Wales with some of our background in cattle there, and it's nice to enjoy some better seasons in the last couple of years than we had before then. So why are we talking about carbon? Apart from the fact that that probably seems reasonably obvious now if you haven't got your head in the sand, the red meat industry has been really proactive in this space. MLA and the industry bodies have developed a Carbon Neutral 2030 program, which I'm sure you've heard something about. The National Farmers Federation has endorsed an economy-wide aspiration of net zero emissions by 2050. And now we've seen large processors like JBS committing to achieving net zero emissions throughout their supply chain by 2040. And more broadly across business, really last year in particular, almost every week the paper had another ASX-listed company making a carbon commitment. So, and of course, towards the end of the year, the federal government following suit. So this has really hit the world in a big way. And a lot of it is still in the phases of working out what it means, how to achieve it, how to measure and track performance over time. And that's a tremendous amount of the work that we're doing. So we have mapped out, I guess, what we call the low carbon or carbon neutral pathway. It starts with understanding emissions, then baselining, benchmarking and setting targets, reducing emissions, carbon storage or generation of carbon offsets, and then reporting and continuous management improvement. You go through, of course, the cycle over and over again as you move towards that sort of goal. And today I'm going to cover off on really all of these, especially the first 4 points, and like I said, just at a high level. So we've got the big picture. So we could start by saying, well, is red meat really that bad? And part of the challenge is, according to the information we have, it's the highest impact meat product on the retail shelf. So it does have I guess, a target on its on that for that reason. And there are some natural reasons for that, and I'll get into it in due course, but the role of ruminants in generating enteric methane is a big one. Now, you can also ask broader questions. So a lot of the work initially has been done in systems where there was no offset of emissions from, say, vegetation or soil. So it's still a work in progress to understand exactly what that emission starting point is. But these results are pretty consistent all around the world. So generally what we say is, unless you're doing something special, chances are red meat's going to have a high emission profile. When I say something special, we'll get onto that in terms of particular vegetation management, soil management, herd management, etc. Now, we do know, of course, that it's not all about greenhouse gas emissions. Get lots of attention at the moment, but the big role of red meat in the world is to generate a high quality human edible product from grass, from something that people can't eat. We can't produce chickens in most of the range, and any of the rangelands in Australia. You can't produce pigs or the grain that supports them. So really, beef and sheep are the mainstay producing a high quality food in those regions. So it's way too simplistic to even say, well, we should just move away from this to another. We understand on this call, I'm sure, the pivotal role that red meat plays, but this is a challenge, and we have to acknowledge that and be able to address it. I guess the other way of looking at it is the challenge, but there's also the opportunity. And without trying to pick out any particular brand, but just for the way of example, you may have heard of this initiative, and this is NAPCO's branded carbon neutral product, one of the first in Australia, and certainly the first accredited under the federal government's climate active certification for carbon neutral beef. So there are ways that we can get on the front foot as well and communicate the good things that are being done. So in order to unpack this, I'm going to step through some basics on understanding emissions so we're all on the same page. The main greenhouse gas emissions in agriculture, we have carbon dioxide. We talk about that a lot in the economy. There's a little bit of nitrous oxide, mainly coming from manure, and a little bit from fertiliser potentially. And then there's methane, which mainly comes from the livestock themselves, and we'll talk about that more in due course. Now, of those gases, methane has a warming effect around 28 times that of carbon dioxide. So a little bit goes a long way. Nitrous oxide is 265 times, so it goes even further, but we tend to have less of it in the production system. If we look at the world, so the global carbon account, it's dominated by fossil fuels and carbon dioxide from fossil fuels. And so, of course, that's where most of the conversation is in the general economy. And this is true in Australia as well. You also have some carbon dioxide released from land clearing, so forestry and other land use, and soil carbon loss as well. And of course, there is that contribution from methane. The big thing that is worth noting is that for sheep and cattle, the profile is completely different. The majority of emissions arise from methane, with a relatively small amount from carbon dioxide, somewhere between about 5 and 20%, depending on how intensive the production system is, and a small component of nitrous oxide. So for red meat, it really is about methane. It's a big part of the story. And where do those emissions arise in a production system? So we have cattle themselves, we have some purchased inputs, we might have some transport, of course, but 80 to 95% of those emissions are arising directly from the livestock. And the more extensive your production system is, the higher the proportion that'll be arising from the livestock themselves. That leaves 5 to 20%, like I said, from purchased inputs, and 20% is closer to a feedlot type system where there's a lot of inputs driving that. And then it's an open question: how much carbon may we be storing that effectively offsets those emissions? And like I said, there's been a lot less work done on this. We might say it's somewhere between 0 and 100%. Certainly, we've done in the last 12 months around about 300 farms doing these kind of assessments, and the full spectrum is there. There's a lot of farms without a great deal of carbon storage going on, and there's a few farms that are carbon neutral. If I was going to pick a sort of a median value, it might have come in around 30% offset. And that was mainly properties in Southern Australia and mainly properties that had conducted some tree planting in the past. But that gives you a bit of an idea of what you might be expecting. Now, since we're focused quite a bit on methane today, I will pause and unpack a few of the challenges that are right down embedded in the science around methane. And this makes it quite difficult, really, to manage as an issue because, in effect, the science isn't settled. We try to equate methane with carbon dioxide, but they're quite different gases. Methane breaks down in the atmosphere. Carbon dioxide basically doesn't. Over time, there's been a drift and a change in the effect, the warming effect that methane is understood to have on the atmosphere. So let's say 7 or 8 years ago, you might commonly hear a number like 21 times the warming effect, and 5 years ago, the common quoted factor was 25 times. Now it's 28. Some people quote numbers as high as 34 warming effect from methane. Part of this problem, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it, but I want to acknowledge it and recognise industry is looking at ways to try and resolve this issue that methane, it does break down. And so have we really got the right understanding of it when it comes to doing this whole assessment? There are different metrics. Global warming potential, GWP star is one that you may have heard of, that try to do a better job of reflecting the warming potential of methane. It's not easy, however. It's not just a straight out switch. And one of the reasons is because we have to be able to compare long-term change in methane, generally 20 years plus, to get a proper read on that. And for the average farm, that's really quite hard to do. So that's one thing. It's worth acknowledging. Stay tuned, watch this space. But we also have a accounting system, if you like, that's a global thing. It's been in place for 30 plus years. We're obligated to report against it as a nation with these current values. So they are the status quo. There's no two ways about that. And one thing to note is whichever indicator you use, changing methane, whether up or down, has a big effect on the atmosphere. So if you increase methane, that has a big warming effect. If you decrease methane, that has a really positive effect on the global warming issue. So it's significant. Whichever way you look at it, it's significant to be trying to reduce methane. So we're talking a great deal about it. What actually is it? Well, methane is a byproduct of ruminant digestion. So it's the same stuff as in natural gas. It's got a warming potential of over 55 megajoules per kilogram. Now, one thing that immediately is obvious about that is it's a major loss of energy from the animal, energy that's not being used to grow beef or produce milk, as the case may be, or wool. It's around about 6% of the gross energy an animal eats. And depending on, digestibility, obviously, it could be as high as 17% of metabolizable energy. Now, that's really significant that if there was a way to harness that or reverse that, and for the animal to be able to utilize that additional energy, particularly in northern systems, it would make a dramatic difference to growth rate. For that reason, methane's been interesting for researchers since the 60s, long before global warming came along. Research was going into methane, firstly to understand it, secondly to know if there's a way to manipulate the rumen so it doesn't produce as much. One thing that happens to be the case in natural systems that have optimized, if you like, to the environment that they're in, is that they can be quite difficult to change systematically. And that has also been the case. There's been a lot of work done on methane. It's relatively difficult to change. However, there are some great new technologies that are at least showing good promise. And they're, interestingly enough, not necessarily showing big increases in productivity from a growth rate point of view, but they are showing some improvement in feed conversion in feedlots. So, in feedlot context, that's certainly money in the bank as well. So it's quite promising. So if we move on then to benchmarks and what you might be able to expect. What this graph shows is emissions in kilograms of carbon dioxide equivalent per kilogram of live weight. And this is the trend in Australian beef performance on 5-year time step intervals through to the most recent analysis, which is 2015. So we did this analysis for the whole national herd, particularly the slaughter herd in this case, and look at this steady decline in emissions, around a 19% decline over time. So that's a positive thing, driven by steady improvements in productivity over that period. Now, one thing that people often do find surprising is that actually the role of the grain-fed industry or the lot feeding industry is actually positive in this story, even when you take into account the grain used and all the production impacts from doing that. Grain feeding increases growth rate, increases the amount of beef relative to the amount of emissions. So it generally has a positive effect on the landscape. So there's a bit of a basis for understanding emissions. Now, I guess perhaps the more interesting question is, what can we do about it? There's 3 big levers that we look at for managing emissions, and you could add a 4th. You could split up livestock management. I'll touch on that in a moment. But effectively, we have livestock management, firstly around optimising the production system and optimising it for methane in particular. And secondly, directly reducing methane. That might be via a feed additive or a vaccine, genetics, etc. The next big sphere, if you like, is vegetation management. And that would be encouraging regeneration, planting trees, etc. And then soil management, encouraging soil carbon sequestration. And I'm going to, again, give an overview of each of those, starting with reducing emissions through livestock management. So to give you a few scenarios, and one thing that's pretty positive in this space is that the things that reduce emission intensity in particular do tend to pull in the same direction as you want to go with productivity anyway. I'm going to use all beef examples, but effectively the same things are the case for sheep as well. So we start with a case study, if you like, 500 cows, current weaning rate 75%, and turning off like a feeder steer, 380 kilos, with those young cattle growing at 0.6 kilos a day from birth to turn off. So they're going to be about 18 months in that sort of order, maybe a little bit younger. Turning off in that herd, 158 tonnes of beef, and emissions you can see there. Now, if we shift the productivity of that herd, and in this case I mean improve the weaning rate, we'll turn off more steers, of course. If we slightly increase the weight turn off as well, with slightly higher ADG, we'll turn off more beef. Now, that's reasonably obvious. We will actually generate more greenhouse gas emissions. So about that sort of 6-7% emission increase. But we will, at the same time, we'll decrease the emission intensity. So lower emissions per kilogram of beef and more efficient production in that case. Now, this then comes to the question of what is it do you want to achieve? If you want to achieve maximum production and lower emissions intensity, you can do that at the same time. If you actually want to reduce gross or total emissions for your farm, from the herd side, you need to combine that higher productivity so that you still produce the same amount of beef, but actually you do it with fewer head of cattle. So in this case, 430 odd cows at that higher performance level will turn off the same amount of beef. So it'll maintain the same amount of beef, but this time it'll decrease total emissions, and it'll also decrease emission intensity at much the same rate. So in this case, you can have an 8% decrease in emission intensity combined with an 8% increase in beef. And of course, depending on where your starting point is, you might have a substantial opportunity to improve on this, or less so. It just depends how close you are to sort of, best practice performance for the district you're in and the genetics you're running. So this just puts these results showing the that shift in total emissions and how the trend doesn't necessarily follow. You can decrease emission intensity, expanding or contracting. So I guess a range of key questions just to leave you to think about. Could you increase weaning percentage? Could you increase weaning weight or growth rates through to slaughter? Could you decrease mortality rate? I didn't talk about it a great deal, but of course, small beef turned off for the same emissions is going to decrease emission intensity. And in effect, could you have a more productive herd or flock with fewer breeders than you run today? Well, that would achieve both a reduction in emission intensity and a reduction in total emissions. Now, there's actually a way to monetize this, and you may have noted the title was with increasing productivity, decrease methane and increase productivity or profitability. Well, the federal government's created a way in which you can generate carbon credits by doing exactly what I'm talking about here, improving the efficiency of the herd. That is called the beef cattle herd management method. There's a little image of the title page right there. It's not for the faint-hearted, and so generally works better in bigger herds. It's not because there's any hard and fast rule about that, but it is a little bit burdensome to do the work to complete what's required of you, and you need it to be audited, etc. But if you've got good cattle records, you're in a position where you think you're able to make these sort of substantial changes, then it's definitely something that you can look at. And if you have a look, it's open access. What projects have been registered? Many of the big cattle companies have registered projects in this space. So that's the productivity side. Now, the other part of the livestock emission piece is around directly reducing methane emissions. And there's a handful of ways. We've talked predominantly about this management one. And if I was going to put an expected change on that, for the herds that we've been tracking for a long time, we can see in the order of 2 to 4% reduction in emissions per annum, where there's a focus on doing so. There's other situations where we returned to farms 10 years later and found no change, and even some analysis that we've been doing recently in some parts of the country showing an increase. So it's not a guarantee that you'll reduce emissions intensity, but for the herds that focus on it, we've seen that sort of 2 to 4%. For breeding, there's certainly options, and of course all those productivity outcomes can be selected for, etc. So breeding's a broad-based sort of thing, and increasingly in the future we'll see breeding values, no doubt, for directly reducing methane and also for improving feed efficiency, which has got a double benefit in terms of productivity as well. But it's slow change, and the biggest challenge with breeding really is there's so many breeding objectives, and to focus on one means to not focus on another. So that has made it a bit of a challenging space, and we haven't seen, I guess it's fair to say, a huge amount of progress in that space unless over the last decade. That leaves us with what can we actually do to try and manipulate the rumen, change it, feed something different, manipulate the diet in order to reduce emissions. Now, I've said here, all those things put together, we're probably talking in the order of 30-odd% emission reduction. There's a few standouts and there's a few exceptions, and I'll touch on them briefly. Now, there's the most prospective options in this space, I'm sure you've heard of in the media. There's a product called red asparaginopsis seaweed, and another product called 3-NOP, or marketed as Bovar. Now, both of those products really well evidenced to reduce emissions. The range I've got there is reasonably broad, but in a feedlot context, Australian feedlot research definitely have seen in excess of 90% knockdown on methane. So that's really, really good news, particularly in the feedlot sector. But it's going to take a reasonable amount of time before we see that widespread in the grazing sector, and there's a few things to overcome, both in terms of getting product out to cattle and also, generally speaking, product is more effective in grain rations than it is in grass rations. So we've got to just temper expectations about a silver bullet that's going to fix all our problems. while at the same time, yeah, we hold hope that those products will make a real difference. Now, another one that's relevant, and particularly in Northern Australia, actually, it's two leading legumes, not only two, but two leading legumes, Leukina and Desmanthus, have been shown to reduce emissions for stop grazing those legumes. So in the order of 5 to 20%, depending on how much is in the sward. So it's small, but it's noticeable. And of course, you have a triple whammy effect with legumes. If you can get a direct reduction, like I'm talking about here, and that's only some particular legumes, I have to stress, not necessarily talking in southern regions about lucerne or something like that. The evidence is around some particular legumes. You get that direct impact. When you introduce legumes into a predominantly grass pasture, you tend to get better productivity out of the cattle. So that helps the previous story we're talking about, herd management. And the third thing is increased nitrogen and increased grass growth tends to boost soil carbon. So there are multiple reasons why that's a good outcome. Well, so we've unpacked a fair bit around methane, but I thought it would be a little bit narrow to stop there. So it's going to take a few minutes. I'm going to do this pretty quickly, even though they're big topics, just so that we try and get a rounded view and touch on carbon storage in vegetation and soil. Now, particularly in talking in the Queensland context, regrowth is now something that we need to think about whether we manage it or we monetize it, or we manage it in order to monetize it. It's a different world now, and we've got whole regions of, particularly in Queensland, to a certain extent in Northern New South Wales, where traditionally we had big losses of carbon, and all those bars on the bottom below the figure were losses of carbon, tree clearing, etc., swinging more recently into increases in carbon. And so there is the potential there to leverage that and to monetize it through various different mechanisms, which I'll touch on in a moment. Now, there's a few things to just note straight up about trees. Firstly, trees aren't trees. They're probably one of the only things where you can see this carbon story right in front of your face. What I mean by that is if there's a lot of wood, there's a lot of carbon being stored. And if there isn't a lot of wood, well, there's not a lot of carbon being stored. So you can actually see it's one of the few things in the whole carbon game that's true. So a really dense forest of fast-growing, heavy timbered trees stores a lot of carbon. Perhaps one of a more balanced sort of forest type context where you've got shrubs, you've got grass, you've got a balance in this, you can expect as well it's not going to store quite as much carbon. So again, talking in I guess the sort of Queensland context, you've heard a lot, no doubt, about monetising this through the most common method is human-induced regeneration, or HIR. Talking in the order of sort of 1 tonne to maybe 7 tonnes, really dependent on rainfall of CO2 equivalent per hectare per year. So under current carbon prices, it does lead to a range of gross returns of $40 to $250 a hectare. So it's certainly not to be sneezed at, and it's, I think, having quite a big effect in Western Queensland and has had over time. So I'm going to quickly scoot on to soils. Now, this is getting even more attention, and there's a great deal of excitement about this. And let me tell you right now, there'll be a huge range of perspectives on this one on the call today, as there would be for quite a few of the things I'm talking about. But I'm going to try and present you the middle of the road view on soil carbon. The first point is that, yes, there's a huge opportunity here. A 0.1% change in soil carbon, 30 centimetres, equals 4 tonnes of carbon per hectare. So that is 7,000 tonnes of carbon dioxide equivalent for 5,000 hectares. And at current prices, you can see you could buy a whole farm on that return almost. And if you want to unpack the maths of that, really, I'll just quickly put it up at a 0.1% change there. You see at 1.2%, you're going to get 46.8 tonnes of carbon per hectare at 1.3%, 50.7. So that's how your maths rolls out. But we also have to temper this a little bit. In Australia, the most common context we have, if you look at all the collective science on soil carbon in Australia, the vast majority of it has been tracking the loss of soil carbon, which is to say we know a bit more about losing carbon than we do about gaining it. And I know that's not necessarily a very positive thing to say, but we've got to recognise where we are at a point in time. So those sort of changes, clearing and cropping, tend to decrease soil carbon over time, and you get this slow decline in particular that particulate and humus organic carbon. The good thing is, if you change that management, if this is a cleared and then cropped context, and you put it into permanent pasture, you will see this big turnaround in carbon. But it happens in a couple of different ways. One is you get a lot more particulate organic carbon quickly, and you get a slow rise back in that humus organic carbon, which is more stable. So you can see there this time frame, even over sort of 40 years, you're still not quite back at where you were in terms of humus, but you're well on the way in total carbon. So it also highlights another thing, that history makes a big difference when it comes to the potential for increasing soil carbon. The lower it is, or the emptier the bucket, if you like, the more chance there is actually filling it again. Sort of practices that influence this, on the negative side, so actually decrease soil carbon, overgrazing, low ground cover, poor soil nutrient levels, cultivation. And then on the positive side, irrigation, perennial pastures, optimising soil nutrient management, optimising grazing rotations, high ground cover, introducing legumes, compost, manure additions, etc. So they're not necessarily in order, those things that add to the side, and you can combine many of them together to improve soil carbon. Now, I was saying about the size of the bucket having the big impact on what your potential really racks up to be. You'll have let's say, a potential that's based on your soil type and your rainfall for any given location, and the depth of the soil for that matter. Then you have an attainable soil carbon level, and that's generally going to be less than what the potential is, and that's going to be limited solar radiation, rainfall, climate variability, etc. Then you have an actual soil carbon level, and that's influenced as well by management practices and historic influences. So then, of course, optimising management is about reversing those things that cause soil carbon loss and focusing on improving carbon. It's the science of it's reasonably straightforward, you might even say. You need to add more carbon into the system, and you need to lose less carbon. So factors that add carbon are on the plus side. Anything that loses carbon is on the negative side. One of the challenges of that is that, let's say pasture renewal, some of the research, and I'm going to touch on it in a moment, has shown that if you go into a pasture renewal phase and you cultivate soil, it can set you back 5 years in terms of soil carbon loss before you make up that again in the new pasture. So cultivation is just a big factor that drives soil carbon loss. So there's all these pluses and minuses happening all the time in a farming system. To give you a bit of context, and this is a Queensland presentation, so I will give more consideration here to grazing in the north part of the country. Best opportunities, and you've heard a lot about this and projects, and increasingly in the next sort of couple of years we'll hear projects that are generating a lot of return out of soil carbon. The leading lights tend to be in high rainfall regions, and they're better off if they actually start with poor management and have a path to improving it. One of the really hard things, though, is that there's not many long-term trials in Australia showing soil carbon change and showing positive soil carbon change. Of the hundreds of studies done, there's really only a handful showing positive change, and that's a real challenge. Like I said, we probably know more about how to lose it than how to gain it. One study that's particularly interesting and relevant in Queensland, Regrowth, and then followed up by Conrad, showed a 0.28% change in carbon in the top 15 centimetres under a Lucina pasture in 31 years. So that'll give you some context for the sort of rates of change that have actually been measured that we have confidence in. So on a per hectare per year basis, it's about 1 tonne of carbon dioxide equivalent. That's in Gayndah, so pretty decent rainfall type country, 760 mils, I think. Ram Dalal, in his paper in 1995, he showed 0.65 tonnes of carbon per hectare per year, which is pretty good. That's in a sort of a rundown verticile cropping soil on the Darling Downs, converted to pasture. But this is only over 4 years, and so history makes a big difference. The first 4 years, you're going to get a better rate of increase, and you shouldn't expect that you can just extrapolate that out forever. The other thing is that it's likely that those changes will stabilise at some point in the future. They won't just keep increasing forever. So soil carbon change is going to have a lifetime. Now, I guess to temper it a little bit is that Diane Allen and their study in 2013, they couldn't find any discernible difference between carbon levels for different grazing management practices in Queensland. So I know that is just a bit of a tricky one, really, because we have some factors that would contribute positively, but it's been very hard to demonstrate that over time. So if the changes are there, they're often more modest than certainly than we'd like them to be, maybe than some people would expect them to be. So you've got to take that literally. Now, to give you a little bit more context, we've seen soil carbon levels really bounce around quite a bit too on farms. Longest farm where we've been monitoring soil carbon's 20 years now of annual soil sampling data. And we've seen in that time swings of 1% both up and down in soil carbon. And it's heavily influenced by that particulate matter carbon. So that's a big change. And like I said, both up and down, droughts have a strong negative effect on soil carbon as well. So anyway, it's not, we're going to learn a lot in the next few years. You'll see a tremendous amount about this topic as we go forward. In terms of monetising that benefit, and I'm nearly ready to wrap up, and I'll invite your questions and comments. I guess there's a couple of pathways. The first is there's an emerging market or markets, whether you're talking beef or wool or sheep meat, for low carbon or possibly even carbon neutral credentialed product. We'll see a lot of movement in this space. It's emerging at this point, but we'll see movement in this space this year. And it's a really important thing to keep in mind, and I'll come back to it on the third point there. The second is, of course, you can sell carbon credits, whether that's soil or vegetation or beef herd management. I've been talking about that now, and that's got its merits for sure. It's a new income stream, and because carbon credits have almost tripled in price, whole lots of practices and projects that maybe didn't stack up only 2 years ago are worth rerunning the numbers on now. But one thing to note is that if you do go ahead and sell carbon credits, in the future, you're not necessarily going to be able to claim that same benefit for the cattle or the sheep that you sell. You can't necessarily sell carbon credits and use those same credits or that same practice to claim that you're carbon neutral. Effectively, if you trade the carbon away, you trade the benefit to whoever buys it. And they may, in that case, use it to make a claim of their own. So you can imagine there'd be a big double counting problem if that was happening widespread. So it's something to keep in mind, because in the future, if markets are chasing low carbon or carbon neutral product, I think we'll see the development of markets where we're attaching that to our product more so than selling it separately. So very quickly on the carbon market, there's two broad ways to do that: emissions avoidance or carbon sequestration. Both generate these things called an Australian Carbon Credit Unit, or an ACCU. So it's a new product that you can develop from a farm, in effect. And like I said, it's rapidly increasing in value, around about that $50 at the moment. And if global sort of signals or anything to go by, it could rise further than that. And of course, that'll change the whole dynamics of the market and give the opportunity to bring on new projects that may not have been cost effective. So it's a pretty exciting space, actually, to be frank, and there's a tremendous amount of interest, unprecedented amount of interest, rising almost exponentially at the moment. So I know that's a big download. If I was going to summarise it in 3 points, I'd say good news story is emission reduction and productivity often do go hand in hand. You can generate win-win outcomes on farms. Second, you can reduce net emissions. Obviously on the emission side we've talked about, and then on the side of generating carbon credit offsets. And that's a new opportunity that is emerging and gathering steam in the land sector. And the third point is that action takes investment and a long-term plan. Don't expect to go in today and baseline your property and be carbon neutral tomorrow. It takes time, it takes planning, and it will take investment. So in order to be ready for that down the track, it really begins now. It's like the old thing they say about planting a tree. When's the best time to plant a tree? About 20 years ago. What's the second best time to plant a tree? Today. So think about it like that, and you'll be well set for the future. Thanks very much. I'll pull it up there, and I believe we've got some time for some questions.